The stories. This motel room voicemail rerouted search teams that winter. They kept saying it started with a motel room that smelled like old coffee and bleach, and with a voicemail nobody expected. The recordings came out in late winter after a storm knocked power across the county and kicked the motel phones awake again. Rhea Tavener was 37 and worked as an emergency coordinator for a spread-out mountain county that never felt ready. She had a habit of keeping paper maps rolled in a rubber band and a small camera tucked under her parka. That morning, she wanted only to rebalance commitments and check that the warming shelter had enough cots for the week. She planned to drive the Ridge Road, swing by the radio repeater, and be back before lunch. The incident started when the Nightlark Motel on the highway called the non-emergency line with a strange message they could not clear. The manager, a tired man named Cal Rudd, told the dispatcher that a red light on room 26 blinked, and the phone kept chiming. He said the display showed a new voicemail that would not delete, and he wanted someone to listen because the guest had left. Rhea took the secondary call because the sheriff's deputies were stacked with fender benders on the main grade. She arrived to find the lobby heater making a low metallic whine, and Cal behind a counter with a cracked bell. He slid the room key and nodded toward the outside corridor, his voice flat from too many nights at the same desk. Rhea used nitrile gloves from her field kit, then lifted the handset and dialed the code that the placard said would access messages. The voicemail opened with a tone and a computerized voice reading the timestamp in a clipped monotone. The date announced sounded like last night near 10, according to her quick notes scratched with a blunt pencil. The message that followed had the kind of audio that police technicians describe as close but muddy, and it made her shoulders rise. A woman whispered that a man was hurt, and she asked for help. Then she mentioned mile marker numbers and a guardrail that bent inward toward a runoff ditch. There was wind noise and the distant thrum of trucks, and what Rhea believed might be the quick chirp of a turn signal. The caller finished with words that sounded like two names, then a tired exhale, then silence long enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. By the time she walked back to the lobby, the dispatcher had already compared mile markers that matched those numbers on the East Highway spur. A search team was gathering at the fairgrounds with 2 four-wheelers and a county plow driver who knew every ditch by seat memory. Rhea signed the log and relayed what she heard, and her own words hardened into directions that sent good people toward a cold bend. An hour later, a second caller reached the tip line and said they had heard the same voicemail when calling the motel to complain about their refund. That person repeated the marker numbers and added that a dog barked once in the background, which persuaded the consensus further. Witness statements began clustering around the east spur, and a deputy noted in the dispatch log that he had seen a bent guardrail near marker 32 2 days prior. The search teams rolled that way in a slow line of lights that looked brave against the blank sky. Rhea drove separately and scanned plow berms that faced the wind, because snow settles in patterns that trap fresh tire ruts longer. She told herself that the timestamp was clean, and that the voice felt close, and that people needed her to stay practical. The first mile produced a stranded sedan with a dead battery and a sheepish driver, and the second mile delivered a drift that swallowed half the lane. They found nothing that matched a serious wreck, only plastic shrapnel and a glove lost last week, which made her think about timing again. Back at the fairgrounds, a radio operator replayed the voicemail on a speaker, and the group leaned in. Rhea asked Cal for the motel's phone vendor contact, and he brought out a binder with hand-printed notes in thick marker. She called the vendor and asked about power cycles and about date behavior when the system lost time, and the technician promised to check archival events. She returned to the voicemail and listened for anything that placed a person rather than a highway, because people leave fingerprints in sound if you keep still. The second listen gave her something new that felt small but pointed. Right after the caller said the mile marker numbers, the wind changed tone for half a second, then a faint clack sounded like an elevator door. That did not belong near a rural guardrail, and it made her write elevator with a question mark next to it, which was not her usual habit. She also caught the soft bleep of a room keycard reader, which could have been the motel hallway if the phone had been on speaker, or a different building entirely. She left the fairgrounds and drove back to the Nightlark with the camera on the seat, planning to map every sound in the hallway against her memory. Cal mentioned that room 26 sat above the ice machine and that the elevator had a sticky door that made a little clap. She asked who stayed in that room last night, and his ledger showed a single occupancy paid in cash by someone who wrote a name that did not match any local license. He shrugged and said the guest checked out at 6 and that housekeeping already turned the room. Rhea asked to see the housekeeping cart, and the housekeeper, a careful woman named Jillian North, said she had found the room tidy. Jillian said the phone had been off the hook at first, which she corrected, and she said the window faced the back lot where trucks idled. Rhea asked if anyone had used the lobby phone when power returned, and Jillian said a traveler borrowed it while waiting for a ride that morning. That detail felt important because lobby phones sometimes route through the same server as the room phones, which can create strange behavior. The vendor called back and reported that their server recorded an abnormal offset during the storm, which could shift timestamps for local voicemail. He said the system fell back to a factory clock tied to a different zone, and then resynced once the internet returned, which can mislabel messages. He promised to send a small report, and Rhea wrote down the gist, then underlined the word offset because she disliked anything that moved signposts during a search. The dispatcher added a note in the log with that information, and the group paused to reassess direction. Rhea listened again and measured the gaps between key clicks and the turn signal chirp, and she kept hearing something like a vending machine compressor. She stepped into the hallway and held her phone down by the ice machine, and her recording later showed the same humming cadence. The voicemail might not have been a live plea from a ditch, but could instead be a message recorded in the building and then captured by the motel system during the storm. She asked Cal whether any old messages archived on the server could return as new after a reset. Cal admitted that he had once lost all messages after a lightning strike and then found them again as new after a technician visit. He said the phone guy joked about ghosts calling back to settle their bills, which did not sound funny to Rhea at that moment. She pressed for dates and asked whether past incidents lined up with heavy weather, and he nodded toward a clipboard full of repair tickets. The dates matched cold weeks when snow slid from the roof, and the idea of an old message waking up felt more likely with each line. The next step was to figure out who had left the recording, and whether the details pointed to the East Spur or somewhere entirely different. Rhea asked for prior registration cards for room 26, and Cal produced a stack bound with a rubber band that snapped on the counter. She gently sorted through and found a multi-night stay from late last winter under a name that also did not match a license. The rate was discounted for cash, and the note column said, "Truck Lot View," which fit the sound of idling engines in the message. She then called the State Patrol office and asked for any incidents last winter that involved a bent guardrail near any similar marker numbers. The trooper on duty searched reports and told her there had been a slide-off on the West Highway spur near marker 32 during a storm in late February. He said the driver had fled before dawn, and a passing snowplow called it in, and the car was recovered later without injuries, according to the archived calls. That wreck would have put a person back in town by breakfast, and possibly in a motel room across from trucks. Rhea returned to the audio and timed the interval between the words and the faint elevator clap, and then timed the lobby elevator with her own phone recording. The match was not perfect, but close enough that a court would likely call it consistent under ordinary conditions, according to her training notes. She also realized the turn signal chirp probably belonged to a guest being dropped at the front door, not a car on the highway. The dog bark could have been a pet in the lot, which often happens near the vending area after check-in. She asked the radio operator to broadcast a simple clarification and to slow the east spur sweep while a second team checked the west. The deputy, who remembered the bent rail on the east, admitted he might have mixed the side of the county in his earlier note, which happens when shifts run long. The west team found the old repair spot with fresh snow around the posts and an evidence marker for a past accident half buried under ice. It seemed the voicemail referenced a prior event that had already closed, and their winter storm had wrapped it in new confusion. Rhea then visited the neighboring diner, where the night shift sometimes noticed details people forgot to hide, and she asked about the guest who paid in cash. The server, a college student named Del Finch, said a man sat alone near the window around 9, then stepped outside to take a call. Del remembered because the man cupped his hand over the motel phone receiver in the lobby, which struck Del as old-fashioned, and then asked for a ride to the bus station. That would place the phone call inside the building. During the same hour, the voicemail claimed, She requested the motel camera footage for the hallway by room 26, and Cal said the system stored 2 weeks, which happened to straddle their storm. The timestamp on the clip showed a flicker at 9:58, right before the server saw the man on the lobby phone, which made her careful notes lean toward a local recording. A county technician extracted the audio from the clip, and while it was muddy, a mechanical ding from the elevator landed exactly where her earlier timing suggested. The odds of a live highway recording sharing those indoor sounds felt very small. The twist arrived quietly when the vendor finally sent logs that showed the voicemail database replayed queued items after resyncing and labeled some as new. One item matched a stored call from late winter last year that had been partially corrupted, then reconstructed during the reboot. The metadata showed room 26 as the destination for that older call, which explained the light and the stubborn message and made the puzzle sad rather than sinister. The message people heard belonged to a different night and a different problem that resolved without tragedy, and it had been pulled forward by a storm. Rhea wrote a summary for the incident file that emphasized the difference between live audio and replayed audio, then highlighted the risks during outages. She recommended an added step where dispatch confirms time against independent sources when a tip arrives through a system that just recovered. She also asked the motel to change their default message code and to put a note by the desk to call her office if room phones behave oddly after storms. Cal agreed and added a bright sticker to the binder with her number, which made her smile despite the long day. The search teams returned after noon with tired faces and a neat inventory, and they ate chili from a crock that steamed the fairgrounds office. Rhea thanked each person by name and reminded them that a wrong turn during a fast morning did not mean a bad job. She said the lesson was about signals and systems and about winter technology that lies twice, and everyone nodded while they warmed their hands. She filled out the reimbursement forms for fuel and gloves and slid the packet into the outgoing tray with a note for finance. In the evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the paper map unfurled and marked the motel with a small circle. She added a line toward the west spur and penciled in the marker numbers with a question mark to reflect how close memory can sit to fact. She listened to the voicemail one last time through headphones, and this time the vending machine compressor sounded obvious enough that she wondered how she missed it earlier. Fatigue makes patterns where there are none, and urgency can turn a whisper into a highway without much effort. A week later, the vendor installed a firmware update that locked time against a battery backup so power glitches could not shift anything. The sheriff added a line to the dispatch checklist about confirming independent clocks, and the radio operator taped a bold reminder above the console. Jillian named the ice machine Manny as a joke in the break room because it hummed in the same rhythm as the recording. Dell laughed and said the elevator still clapped, but only when someone shoved a luggage cart too hard against the door. In a different winter years ago, the same storm pattern had toppled a repeater and blacked out an entire valley, which lived in Rhea's head. She thought about that while walking past a wall of snow tools at the supply shed, and she decided to put spare batteries for hotel systems on the grant list. It felt like a small change inside a big map, and that was how she survived seasons that piled risk on top of routine tasks. She pinned the grant idea to her bulletin board and wrote a short sentence that read, "Verify time before direction." No one ever found the man who left the cash registration during the recent night because he boarded the bus and vanished into ordinary life. The earlier driver from last winter had been located and fined, according to the archived paperwork, which made that thread tidy in the official sense. The county slid back into the rhythm of plows and calls and an occasional lost tourist, and the motel phone stayed quiet except for room wake-ups. The red light over room 26 stopped blinking, and the ice machine chugged along with stubborn loyalty. Rhea kept the pencil notes in a folder labeled with the motel name and the date and included a copy of the vendor logs. She handed a training copy to the new deputy class and asked them to listen once without context, then again with the building map. The exercise worked because people learned how easily a detail snaps a hunch in half, and how worth it is to test every hunch. They left with a habit of checking other clocks before sending trucks into the cold, which is the sort of habit that quietly saves lives. By late spring, the guardrail on the west spur reflected the sun with a fresh coat of paint, and the plow berms had slipped away. The fairgrounds chili pot was replaced with a cooler of sports drinks, and the radio chatter turned toward camping permits and picnic warnings. Nobody brought up the voicemail during the season kickoff meeting, but everyone remembered the morning they chased a ghost along the East Spur. The minutes simply read Time Verification Protocol Updated, which looked small on paper and felt big in practice. People who were not there will say it was obvious from the start, and they will wonder why teams moved before verifying. People who were there remember the tone in that whisper, and the way good intentions sprint when wind hits the valley wrong. Rhea thinks the truth sits between those angles, and that winter rewards humility more than certainty, especially when phones and storms share a stage. She wrote that in the margin of her map, in handwriting that tilted uphill like a person leaning into a cold night. When she passed the Nightlark one afternoon with the window cracked, she heard the elevator clap echo through the empty corridor. It sounded like a period at the end of a long sentence that finally made sense, and she let the thought linger until the highway bent. The motel squatted back into its season of travelers who just need a warm bed and a snow-free path to the door. The voicemail lived on in a folder, and in the way the county listened to machines, and in the simple habit of checking the time. The stories. Dispatcher, who kept the secret from a bridge call, the call began with the sound that never leaves him, a river hush that sat under a thin voice. On the log, it read as a welfare check near the west span. The timestamp matched the shift change. The tower camera sent a smeared view of headlights, and the wind pushed rain and slanted ropes across steel. He wrote the first line in block letters. Male caller. Alone? No traffic lane blocked. Unknown age. Unknown intent. In training, they, from the start, had said the first 10 seconds decide the rest. He believed that for years. He had a plain goal that night. Finish paperwork early, drink the cold coffee anyway, and get home before midnight. Kellen Duarte, age 38, worked as an emergency dispatcher in a river town that never liked headlines. He lived quiet. 2 rooms over a grocery where the owner knew his name and saved him bruised peaches. He was good at the slow voice and the clear questions. He kept a notebook with dates and little arrows. On the tape, his opening line sounded the same as always. County Communications, tell me what is happening. The caller coughed, then said he was at the railing near the center truss. He asked for no sirens. Kellen clicked a marker on the map and moved the cursor a hair so the unit tags would not overlap. He asked for a name, and the caller hesitated like he was picking one from a shelf he had not visited. Call me Ross, the man said, then added something about the water looking like foil if you did not blink. There was a push of air, like a mic against a jacket, and the traffic under the bridge hummed steady. Kellen kept the tone even, told Ross that people could meet him where he stood, and asked what brought him there. Someone I loved died on this bridge, Ross said. And his voice steadied, like he had waited to finally say it. In his log, Kellen wrote the words that mattered. Loss stated. Prior connection to scene. No weapons reported. Calm speech. From the other console, Nira scrolled road closures and passed him a sticky note that read, Northbound lane is clear. He muted the room feed for a second, so the printer squeal would not land in Ross's ear and spook him. He asked the year of the loss, and Ross said it fast, like it tasted bad. 2014. Kellen repeated the year and let the silence work while he dispatched a patrol car and a medic unit in the background. He knew the story people told about that year. A sedan climbed the curb during a storm and hit a contractor. The papers had run one photo of cones and a dropped hard hat. No names followed, just an archived blurb and rain. From the tower camera, a freight train horn carried along the riverbank, then faded as the unit names flashed en route. Kellen asked if Ross knew the person who died by name. Ross said he knew the face and the last words. A small thing changed in Kellen then. A sound from the record shelf in his mind fell flat and stayed there. He once took a midnight call from a work crew foreman near the same span. He kept that tape in memory. Ross said the last words were not for him. They were for a dispatcher who told the crew to hold 10 minutes. Kellen tapped the headset cushion, careful to keep the room quiet, and asked where Ross had heard those words. Ross said he had heard them from a phone found in a cracked case under the North Pier after the storm. He said the phone worked for one day after the rain stopped, and that he had played the last message recorded. He said the message was from county communications with a different voice, and it told the crew to stay clear. Kellen felt the old shift wash through him. The storm year had ended in a tangle of rumors and a closed memo. He had read that memo while filing tired overtime sheets. He filed it without speaking and chose to keep moving. On the camera, one pair of headlights slowed near the shoulder as if a driver could sense the weight of the rail. Kellen radioed the nearest cruiser to stage 2 blocks off with lights off, and he asked Nira to notify the medic quietly. He asked Ross to tell him who the contractor was, and Ross said the name with a short stop between first and last. The name matched the contractor mentioned in the closed memo, except the memo had spelled the name without an accent mark. Kellen wrote the name as Ross said it, exact and careful, then underlined it once for the transcription that would follow. He asked Ross why he came now and not earlier, and Ross said an anniversary sits on the mind like a stone. He also said that the memo never named the dispatcher who told the crew to hold, which was why he had called. Kellen understood the shape of that ask, even if the words around it were soft. He was not supposed to name staff. The policy existed for safety and sanity, and it covered nights when grief needs a door and someone tries that door. He told Ross he could share what the record allows, and he asked if hearing the process might help him stand. Ross said hearing the process might help, though he refused the idea of sirens again and asked for plain truth instead. Kellen kept his sentence length slow and warm. He said that storm calls can trigger staggered staging for worker safety. He said if there were downed lines or compromised joints, a hold might be given while a state engineer was patched in. He also said that every such hold carried timestamps, and that those stamps were kept by policy for 7 years. Ross breathed in and asked what happens when 7 years have passed, and Kellen answered before he could think of softness. He said the system cycles recordings to deep archives after 7 years, and some are erased when retention windows expire. Ross said he had a copy in case the archive could not confirm. Then he claimed the voice on the tape named a company. He said the tape used a phrase that a dispatcher would not use unless someone off-channel asked for a careful delay. Kellen had heard that phrase once. It was the night a junior engineer requested a slow approach while a supervisor closed a lane. The phrase was not suspicious by itself, and yet, in memory, it wore the shape of a request he never liked. He asked Ross to read the phrase, and Ross said it. Hold 10 for a clear handoff if site control is missing. Nira glanced over with a look that said, do not get pulled into the river. Kellen nodded and kept the pace steady. He told Ross he could not speak to motives of old voices, and he could not name a colleague or contractor from memory. He said he could meet Ross with a sergeant who knew the policy, and they could file a supplemental report for records. Ross said he was tired of reports. Then he asked a new question. Was someone paid to push that hold in the storm? Kellen chose his words like glass marbles placed in a line. He said he had not seen evidence that proved a bribe. He said he had seen maintenance slips that missed dates in years with bad weather, and he had seen budgets cut twice. He said contracts sometimes shifted mid-season, and miscommunication could look like intent when viewed through grief and time. The cruiser staged in the dark lot of a bait shop, and the medic idled near a closed diner with frosted windows. The tower camera picked up 2 figures near the midspan, and the wind made their jackets move like wet flags. Kellen asked Ross if someone stood with him, and Ross said a cyclist had stopped and was holding a flashing light. He asked the cyclist for the phone, and the cyclist, shouting through wind, said he would hold the light where Ross stood. Kellen brought the cruiser onto the bridge, slow and quiet, then asked Ross to look over his right shoulder for headlights. He said he would keep talking while the car approached, and he would ask simple things about the person lost. Ross began to tell a short life. He said she had a laugh that came in bursts, and she liked folded maps. He said she had taken a night shift to help a younger sister, and she kept a lanyard with a faded tag. He said he watched her set cones before the storm hit, and he watched the curve where the sedan took the line. He said no one saw the driver afterward, and the report guessed water pushed evidence downriver where it turned to silt. He said the tape he found made his chest hurt because someone with a badge kept people where the wind was worst. Kellen said he heard the pain and he believed the sincerity. Then he asked Ross to step back from the rail 1 foot. He said small choices add minutes, and minutes stack into plans, and plans turn into days that someone can live through. The cruiser moved a foot at a time. The officer called in with a whisper to confirm eyes on the subjects. The wind kicked a tab of paper along the sidewalk, and the camera caught it hopping like a small animal in rain. Kellen asked Ross about the cracked case at the pier, and Ross said the fisherman who found it gave him the phone. He said he cleaned the mud with rice and heat, and the screen woke like a held breath and showed the saved audio. Kellen pictured a kitchen table with towels and a humming space heater and the stubborn work of saving a last voice. He told Ross that someone who would do that kind of work could also stand away from the edge and breathe tonight. Ross said people kept calling him crazy when he brought the phone around, and one clerk said to forget old storms. He said he would go if someone could promise the message would not vanish into a hole where things get lost. Kellen had a rule: never promise anything that depends on someone else. He made a different promise instead and wrote it down. He said he would take a copy himself, and he would log it as a citizen recording attached to a supplemental report. He said he would list the time and origin as provided, and he would initial the line and add a contact number. Ross went quiet, and the wind filled the line again, and the cruiser stopped a car length away with no flashers. The officer on the bridge said he saw a second person keeping distance, and the cyclist raised the light toward the railing. Kellen asked Ross if hearing a small true thing might help him come off the rail. Ross told him to say it plain. Kellen told him there was an internal review back then, and it did not find a bribe, but it did find a silence. He said a manager failed to file a conflict disclosure, and a vendor had a nephew on a crew scheduled for that week. He said the manager resigned before the report made the rounds, and the findings lived behind a line marked personnel matter. He said he had read that line with tired eyes and wished it said more, and that was the part he kept. He did not say the other part out loud, which was the line about a recommended reprimand for delayed notifications. He did not say the name of the dispatcher who missed a handoff while moving units during the storm shift. He did not say that the reprimand belonged to him for a calendar mistake that lost 2 minutes when the server lagged. He believed the 2 minutes had not caused the death, yet he carried them like a coin that burned his pocket. Ross stood very still. He asked why no one told the public that someone had been asked to resign quietly. Kellen said the county tells what it must by law, and the rest gathers dust and waits for someone to ask again. He said he understood that wait, then asked Ross to walk toward the cruiser while the cyclist kept the light behind. Ross said he wanted to hand the phone over himself and watch it enter the chain that could not be erased. Kellen told the officer to receive the device and document the handoff on camera, then he told the medic to stage closer. He kept talking to Ross about the quiet details of grief as the officer moved with hands open and calm shoulders. Ross stepped away from the rail, and the wind made the tension a little louder. Then the cruiser door clicked open. The officer took the phone and read the time on the screen for the camera, then thanked Ross and nodded at the cyclist. The medic stepped out with a blanket and stood near, and the cyclist said he would bike Ross home if that helped. Kellen set the line to a low hold and told Nira to mark the recording flagged for retention review and supervisory copy. He also wrote a note for himself to call records in the morning and ask for a manual pull from the deep archive. He would say the citizen copy exists and should be paired with any surviving log from the storm year for clarity. He would not say the rest, which was that he had been the one to misread the calendar view during a switch. He shifted to the closing questions that help people move. Any harm today? Any plan tonight? Any safe place to stay? Ross said he would stay with a friend who owed him a favor, and he would bring coffee to the cyclist as thanks. He said he would wait to hear if the recording matched the archive, and he would not visit the bridge again at night. Kellen said someone would call him within 3 business days, which felt safe to offer, and he wrote his own number anyway. He signed the log with a quick line and filed the incident under welfare resolved with evidence collected and no injury. The bridge camera caught the cruiser pulling away slow while the medic followed, and the cyclist lights faded toward the trail. Nira slid over a cup with fresh coffee and asked if he was okay, and he said yes, since people had stepped off safe. He picked up his notebook and drew a small square around the words he had written, which read, "Keep the silence clean." He drove home as rain dripped from the awning of the grocery, and the owner waved from a dark window with a thin smile. He unlocked the door and set his notebook on the table. Then he took the spare tape recorder from a drawer beside the sink. He spoke the date and the incident number and a short summary. Then he said 7 words that were just for the tape. He said the bridge call reminded him why small errors multiply and why a person can choose to carry them alone. In the morning, he brought the tape to the records clerk as a personal note to accompany the citizen copy for context. He did not include the part about his own reprimand, which lived on paper in a file that no one requested. He told the clerk that the caller needed confidence, that the system held memory, and the clerk said that part was done. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived to confirm the match, and the archived call contained the same phrase and timing. The letter said the review board would annotate the old memo to reflect the vendor relationship that had been missed. It also said the findings still pointed to weather and a panicked driver as primary causes rather than any delayed instruction. Kellen stood at the window and read the lines twice, then folded the letter and slid it under the notebook cover. He walked the long way to work and past the river that pretended to be quiet, while tugs moved lumber under the span. He thought about the part he had kept and judged whether it belonged in daylight or whether it still lived best in private. He decided to hold it until it served someone to hear it, which was not the same as hiding and felt closer to care. The stories. Church basement inventory revealed alleged proof of entry. The basement smelled like wet cardboard after last week's rain, and the fluorescent lights flickered with that jittery, tired kind of buzz. The line that mattered on the clipboard looked boring at first, but it carried a small number that should have been bigger. Her name was Nora LeClaire, age 34, community center custodian and part-time bookkeeper for the small church pantry. She had the Tuesday shift, which mostly meant moving pallets, counting cans, and scrubbing the concrete where the sump spat out rusty water. She wanted to finish early, pick up a thrifted lamp for her apartment, and call her sister about a family thing. The incident began when she saw the dented case of condensed soup sitting on the wrong pallet, with a slip stapled crooked. A volunteer wrote a note saying damaged during last drop, which did not match the neat handwriting she recognized from Sunday. The sump had overflowed during the storm, and the security cameras upstairs reportedly lost power around the same time. She checked the ledger, found last month's count for the soup, and tapped the line with a capped marker before reading twice. The numbers disagreed by 8 units, and the shrinkage column did not carry any explanation or initials. That should have thrown her for a minute, but a volunteer named Lyle had logged minor adjustments before, then forgotten to sign. She walked the aisles between pallets, past the bin of torn paperbacks, and the rack of winter coats that smelled like cedar chips. A faint drag mark curved through the thin crust of silt left by the flood, wide enough for a small hand truck wheel. It started by the loading door, then slipped behind the pantry shelves where the camera never had a sightline. Nora took photos on a battered phone, making sure the timestamp showed the date, then set the clipboard on a milk crate. She drew a simple diagram in her notebook, noting each pallet corner, then circled an area where floor paint looked scuffed. She counted the soup again, slowly, touching each can and speaking the numbers under her breath. 8 missing, she said, and it landed with more weight than she expected. She did not like accusing anyone, and the pantry had a habit of losing track during rush weeks. Still, the door to the loading ramp had fresh scrapes near the latch, and the volunteer key box upstairs had been sticky since the humidity climbed. The complication widened when she checked the box of hygiene kits and found a weird mix of travel bottles and 3 missing toothbrush packs. Those packs were counted by weight on a cheap scale, and the number on the sticky label did not match the ledger. The printer upstairs had jammed on Sunday, which meant someone finished the label by hand and skipped the second signature. A neighbor named Pete, age 57, retired mechanic, leaned down the stairwell and called everything steady down there. He helped with deliveries since his shop closed, and he kept spare bungee cords in his truck like trophies. She told him about the numbers, and he shrugged while scratching his jaw with a knuckle. Probably rain week jitters, he said. Then he looked at the drag mark and stopped talking for a beat. The mark led under a folding table, then faded near the coats. He pointed at the wall and said, "That outlet tripped last night. I reset it around 6. Nora asked who else came in yesterday, and Pete listed 2 volunteers by first names, then mentioned a teenager who picked up old pew cushions. She noted every name, added question marks where needed, then walked the perimeter slowly with her phone light near the baseboards. A glint showed beneath a stacking chair, so she nudged it aside and found a broken zip tie. The tie was the same size used for coat rack tags, but also the same size used on the loading door latch. She set it on the milk crate, then checked the thermostat in the storage room because the compressor sounded odd. The thermostat was set to a colder number than usual, and someone had switched the fan to constant instead of auto. She checked archived calls on the office phone, each scribbled on a pad by the reception desk, and saw a message about a refrigeration tech. The date on that message matched the storm, and the next line said, "Service postponed due to flooded bridge," which made sense. The fridge down in the basement had been stubborn for weeks, and everyone had opinions about it. The investigation took shape slowly, with tight steps that felt small until they did not. She photographed the drag, the zip tie, and each shelf with missing soup. She called the non-emergency number listed on the bulletin board, then explained she was not reporting a crime, only logging irregularities. The dispatcher told her to keep notes and offered a reference number she wrote at the top of the page. She interviewed a woman named Karina, age 42, school cafeteria worker, who came for a bag of pantry staples before her evening shift. Karina said she saw a man at the ramp door on Monday wearing a baseball cap that hid most of his face. He held a coat on one arm, and he carried a reusable bag with a grocery logo. He left quickly when a choir member came through with sheet music and coffee. Nora thanked her, wrote down the details, then asked Pete if a delivery truck had come without posting in the group chat. He said no trucks except the dairy driver, who dropped crates outside after the storm. He showed his phone, scrolling through photos of the ramp, and pointed to a picture from early morning that showed the door closed with a new scratch near the bottom hinge. She opened the binder of fire inspection reports, looking for any change that registered during the outage. The inspection from 2 months ago said the exit alarm was functioning, and the last weekly test had initials from Lyle again. She went to the exit door alarm, pressed test, and watched the light flash, but heard no chirp. The battery had been pulled slightly, not fully removed, just eased out enough to break contact. She took a picture with the battery number visible, then slid it back in and heard the chirp, which made her flinch. Pete raised his eyebrows and said, "That is not wind," which sounded like a joke until he saw her keep writing. She checked a box of donation forms under the big table, where volunteers slipped notes when drop-offs came after hours. One envelope had muddy smears on the edge, and the handwriting said coats only with an underline that went too far. Inside sat a receipt from a thrift store with a timestamp from late Sunday, and a note that said leave by ramp door because of stairs. Nora called the thrift store, asked a clerk if a man in a cap had bought bulk coats, and waited while the clerk checked. The clerk said yes. A tall man with a limp bought 9 coats and paid cash, then took the bus toward the river stop. Nora wrote that quickly, added the time, and drew a tiny bus icon without thinking. She opened the old laptop in the office and loaded the final footage saved before the outage, which barely showed the stair-top landing. A shadow crossed the landing on Monday evening at dusk, carrying something bulky, then returned minutes later with faster steps. The camera angle could not catch a face. Only the cap brim and the arm load, which looked like quilt batting or a heavy sleeping bag. She thought about the soup, the hygiene packs, and the coats, then thought about the drag mark that ended near the rack. The rack had a hidden caster that always swiveled wrong, which left that same half-moon scrape when pushed sideways. She crouched and touched the caster, finding a smear of silt that did not match dust from raised corners. The twist snapped into view when she turned the soup case and saw a tiny sticker tucked behind the manufacturer's label, handwritten in blue ink. The sticker said Tuesday return hold with initials that were not Lyle's, which matched a habit from a former volunteer named Mateo. He left months ago after a family problem, but he signed returns with looping letters that everyone teased. Mateo's sister had asked for help in winter, and someone recalled she lived near the river park in a tent for a month. Witness statements from that season mentioned a man with a limp who avoided the main entrance because of pride. The archived calls showed a message from a restricted number on Monday evening, which said, "Ramp door buzzer broken, will circle back at dusk." Nora realized the inventory miscount for soup matched exactly the number of coats purchased at the thrift store on Sunday. 8 missing cans, 9 coats reported, and 3 toothbrush packs absent from the hygiene bin. She checked the program binder that tracked special requests, which listed a short note from 2 weeks ago about a family living in a truck with limited storage. Soup was labeled easy to heat, coats were labeled heavy but foldable, and toothbrushes were labeled priority for school-age kids. She looked at the ramp door again and saw a second set of scrapes, higher up, where a crutch might have knocked paint from the frame. She remembered Mateo broke his ankle years back, and the limp never fully left. Pete cleared his throat and said, "You think this is not a break-in, right?" Nora kept her voice steady, then said, "It looks like someone who knew the layout, who made sure the alarm stayed quiet, and who avoided asking directly because of shame." He rubbed his jaw, then nodded slowly as he watched her take a photo of the scraped paint. They called the non-emergency line again, and she read her notes while the dispatcher typed. The dispatcher said an officer could make an informational visit tomorrow and advised them to secure the door and replace the tie. She logged the reference number, stapled the list of missing items to the daysheet, then wrote a clear statement about suspected entry without damage for records only. She left a message for the pantry coordinator, age 51, paraeducator, explaining the situation with careful words about the storm and the power hiccup. She suggested moving the coat rack upstairs during inventory days and adding a second sign-off when labels were handwritten. She also suggested leaving a clear path for people who struggled with stairs, which sounded like a tiny policy shift hidden inside a counting problem. An hour later, a choir member named Lorna stopped by for her binder, and Nora asked if she had seen anyone at the ramp on Monday. Lorna said a man waited near the dumpster just before the thunder started again, holding a bag and looking anxious. She brought him into the vestibule briefly, offered water, and pointed him toward the office for assistance, but he left before she finished tuning the piano. Nora thanked her, logged the time, then matched it with the shadow on the final footage that crossed the landing at dusk. The puzzle fit without heroics, and the proof sat in quiet things like stickers and scratches and silt. The pantry had not been ransacked, only visited by someone who treated the space like an old workplace where he still belonged a little. She printed a fresh sign for the ramp that said "Ring bell twice for assistance," then taped it high where bus riders would see it. She taped another sign next to the loading latch that reminded volunteers to check the exit alarm light before locking. Pete found a spare battery for the alarm in a drawer and switched it while whistling a few off-key notes. Before leaving, she took one last slow walk with the clipboard, checking counts, finding that the numbers now made a practical sort of sense. The soup miscount lined up with the return sticker, the drag mark matched the broken caster, and the exit alarm explained the quiet door. The proof of entry was not dramatic, yet it was enough to tell a story that accounted for every small change. The next afternoon, the coordinator called back after speaking with a patrol officer who agreed to mark the report as information only. The officer reportedly checked dispatch logs from the storm night and confirmed multiple power blips across the block, which could explain the camera outage without conspiracy. The coordinator also reached Mateo through a community contact, who acknowledged taking coats and supplies, then offered to meet with her to return the soup or sign for it officially. Nora sat at the folding table and wrote a short summary for the pantry records, keeping it plain and careful and believable. She described the season's pressure, the storm, the small mistakes, and the way people try to preserve dignity when they are worn thin. She ended with a simple line about counting what matters and leaving a light where it can be found. She locked the loading door with a fresh tie, turned the thermostat back to normal, and unplugged the stubborn fridge for a counted 10 before restarting. The compressor settled into a softer hum that made the space feel less anxious, and the fluorescent lights kept their flicker but seemed less harsh than earlier. She put the clipboard away, then washed the silt from her hands until the water ran clear. On her way up the steps, she looked back at the neat rows of cans and the rack of coats that hung like quiet witnesses. The basement did not feel like a crime scene. It felt like a place that absorbed hard weather and kept doing its small work. The inventory told the story the way ledgers often do, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and specific enough to be true. Pete waited by the door and asked if she still wanted to find that lamp after her shift, and she smiled and said yes. He held the door as they stepped into the thin sunshine that follows a week of rain, where water still shone in shallow puddles. She made a mental note to buy a pack of batteries and write bigger labels, then walked toward the sidewalk with an easier stride. Later that week, the coordinator posted a message thanking the volunteers for patience and reminding everyone to sign twice when handwriting labels. The note also said the ramp bell worked again and that the basement alarm had a new battery with a date written in marker. A final line invited anyone needing help to knock during open hours and to leave a note if mobility made the stairs hard. Nora kept the broken zip tie in a drawer with a handful of odd things that never quite fit anywhere. She wrote the date on a card and tucked it with the tie as a simple reminder that proof can be small and stubborn. The basement went back to smelling like cardboard instead of worry, and the flicker of the lights felt ordinary again. She told her sister about the lamp and then about the inventory, and they both laughed quietly at how much a can of soup can reveal. The town kept moving around them in a slow, practical rhythm that ignored weather until it had to pay attention. The story rested inside a file folder without drama, but with enough careful detail to be respectfully believed. The stories. This motel room voicemail raised a separate question. On a rainy Tuesday, near the end of tourist season, a motel room voicemail carried a question that did not belong. It turned a tired end of shift into something careful and strange, and it started with a blinking red light. Dorian Pike worked nights at the Northway Motor Inn, 37, a patient manager who fixed things others ignored. The place sat off a service road past a truck stop, with a diner and a feed store as neighbors. He started that shift with a simple goal: balance the register, finish the towel count, and coax the ice machine back alive. The storm slowed arrivals, and the security monitor rolled its quiet grayscale loop of the parking lot. Housekeeping left a note about room 12, the kind of note other managers forgot to read. The bed looked unused after checkout, the television glowed at low volume, and the phone message light blinked at eye level. He carried a spare key, pushed the door open, and smelled damp carpet and motel soap. Nothing surprising. The news channel murmured through commercials, a static map of counties he could name without trying. On the nightstand sat a spiral notebook half full of block letters, a takeout cup, and a key card with the room number worn. He pressed the voicemail button with his knuckle because the button shocked him once in summer. A male voice filled the room with a flat question that stopped his hand, like a bad chord laid wrong. The voice asked, "Did you move the smoke detector again?" And then silence, followed by the system tone and cutoff. He replayed it twice, and the question felt like a pebble in a shoe, something to be dealt with. Smoke detectors did not get moved by guests without reason, and nothing about the room said routine or careless. Dorian checked the detector on the ceiling, a cheap white unit that did not match the others on the hall. The motel used one supplier for replacements, and this casing lacked their sticker and the penciled date inside. He stood on the chair, unscrewed the ring, and found fresh scuffs around the mounting plate as if removed recently. The unit felt heavier than a sensor should, and the test light never flashed, which meant battery or guts. He set it down on the table, and the vent above the television rattled just a little with the wind. He turned off the television, let the room get quiet, and heard faint tapping through the vent to the next room. The motel had a habit of telling its secrets through noise, and he had learned that language over years. He stepped into the hall and knocked on room 14, where a regular was finishing a long week of fieldwork. Quinn Hauer was 29, a cell tower contractor with a tool bag and a precise way of speaking. Quinn opened the door and said, "Heard the tapping, thought it was heat. But it kept hitching, like somebody counting seconds." Dorian nodded, thanked him, and walked back to room 12 with the detector in his hands and a growing list. He checked the guest ledger for that room, found the name Shane Bennett written in rough ballpoint yesterday afternoon. The rate was paid in cash with a $20 deposit, and there was a note about requesting a high floor. The motel only had 2 floors, which made the request sound like reflex, not preference, and it bothered him. He logged into the creaking PBX console behind the office door, a beige box that stored more than it admitted. The system kept message times, not caller numbers, but it stored archived call counts and extension traces within limits. The voice message timestamp put the call at 4:21 this morning when he had been home asleep. The system marked it as external to the motel, but without a number, which meant blocked or masked through a service. He played the message once more through the PBX speaker, and this time he listened past the words to the air. There was a faint horn in the background, not a car, something long and low that cut through the compressor hum. The town had two train crossings, one near the elevator factory, the other near the river access by Mill Road. The factory horn sounded higher by habit, and the river crossing had a long, lonely tone that travelers remembered. He wrote train horn in the notebook, then dialed the non-emergency line and described a suspicious device in room 12. He kept the language careful and factual, and the dispatcher asked for his name, then said a unit would respond. Housekeeper Irina Kowalski stopped by the desk to clock out. 58. Quiet. A 10-year veteran of the place. She saw the detector on the counter and said she smelled glue when she changed linens, thought it came from that. He asked if she saw anyone in room 12 after checkout, and she said only a woman with a baseball cap. She had a service bucket and a ring of keys, and Irina thought she was with maintenance, since she walked like staff. There were two maintenance guys by payroll. Neither wore caps, and neither worked Tuesdays after 3 in the afternoon. He wrote this down, then checked a clipboard of deliveries, and found a package signed by someone not on schedule. The box came yesterday morning for guest Bennett, signed by a scrawl that did not match any front desk initials. It contained a replacement smoke detector per the note, which made the blinking voicemail question feel heavier. Dorian carried the box to the office, found bubble wrap inside, plus a cutout where the detector had Saturday, tape residue stuck in a neat circle on the cardboard, and a tiny zip bag with nothing in it fell from a seam. He looked at the detector again under the desk lamp and noticed a slot behind the grill where no slot should be. He slid a paperclip in and clicked against something spring-loaded, which offered and then refused to move. The responding officer arrived while the storm thickened, and his boots left dark prints that dried like islands. He introduced himself as Deputy Holloway, 40, calm voice, and asked for the room key, the voicemail, and the timeline. Dorian played the message for him on the office speaker, and the train horn showed itself again under the words. Holloway wrote it down, then called in the serial from the detector, and the brand came back to a discount dropshipper. They walked to room 12 with the box, and Holloway took photos with a little camera that hated the low light. He gave Dorian latex gloves from his pocket, then pointed at the slot and said he would rather not break it. Dorian tried the paperclip again, this time with a little twist and a push, and the plate popped forward an inch. Inside sat something that was not a sensor, a puck with a lens barely visible and a microcard at the edge. He did not pull it, he did not touch the lens, he just looked at Holloway, whose jaw tightened for 3 beats. The deputy called dispatch and asked for a detective on call, then told Dorian to step back and breathe. The motel office had a rule about honesty with guests, which worked until honesty touched evidence and risk. Dorian printed a sign for the counter that said service delay for weather, and the storm covered that small necessary lie. Holloway kept the room closed and waited for the detective, while Dorian returned to the PBX to audit messages. He printed the log for the last 2 days, circled 3 external calls to room 12, all between midnight and 5. He played the first 2 messages carefully, and they were empty hang-ups, with the same horn underneath and 1 faint laugh. He resisted all guessing and wrote horn consistent in a margin, then underlined the time of the 3rd message. He checked the security drive for the hallway, and the camera caught only the tops of heads and a bit of shoulder. At 3:12 this morning, a person in a cap walked by with a tote, turned left, and vanished from frame. Dorian paused on the frame and noted the sleeve stripes, a set of 2 pale bands near the wrist. Irina had seen a cap on the woman, and the frame showed hair tucked tight, with a loose strand at the neck. Detective Renner arrived with a kit and a steady patience, a mid-40s investigator who disliked motel carpet. She listened to the voicemail twice, glanced at the detector, and asked Dorian to walk her through intake and checkout. He explained the cash payment, the request for a high floor, and the delivery for a detector that should not change. She wrote as he talked, asked about prior incidents, and he mentioned 2 privacy complaints from summer travelers. Those complaints stopped after he replaced room units from the same run, and he had kept the receipts and dates. He pulled copies from the accordion file, and she photographed them, then asked whether any rooms shared vent passageways. He described the vent layout, straight shaft between rooms in pairs, with thin walls that carried sound farther than comfort. Renner nodded and walked to room 14, asked Quinn to step into the hall, and confirmed the tapping report. Quinn described the pace like a metronome, not random, 2 taps, then a short pause, repeated until the thunder started. Renner wrote it down, and Dorian drew the pattern in a margin, then realized something he had missed earlier today. The television in room 12 was on the news channel at low volume, which travelers often used as a decoy. Some people left it on to pretend someone was inside, which meant the room might have been staged after a quick exit. Renner opened the detector with gloves and eased the card into a tiny envelope, then sealed it with her initials. She asked Dorian about any computers to view file sizes, not contents, just metadata, and he shook his head no. She used her agency laptop to check what the card held, and the screen reflected in the blank television glass. The card contained multiple files named by date and time, a standard naming scheme, which meant scheduled recording, not motion. Renner closed the laptop without opening anything and said the specifics would wait for a warrant and a lab. She asked for the guest profile again, and he gave the same summary, plus the note about the signed delivery receipt. Dorian returned to the box and saw a faint watermark in the cardboard that read Consolidated Freight with a Town. The town sat by the river tracks where the Longhorn lived, and the company ran a warehouse near the ramp. He wrote the company down as an external lead, then called the number printed on their listing from a web search. He asked, in his perfectly polite desk voice, whether any packages left for a motel guest yesterday morning. The dispatcher said they handed one small box to a contractor with a name that matched no employee on file. It was recorded on their log with a time, and the signature block contained the same scrawl as his earlier photocopy. Renner thanked him for the call, took the information, and said she would handle any next contact with that company. She requested the spiral notebook from the room, and Dorian placed it in a bag, pages open to the block letters. The letters contained hotel names and highway exits, a list of routes that matched a traveler who did not like surprises. Some lines included cable channel numbers, others included lamplight wattages, and one included the word ceiling with a star. Dorian remembered a complaint from 2 weeks ago from a different guest about a beeping detector in room 5. He checked his maintenance log and found he replaced that unit on a Wednesday after a short argument about deposit charges. He fetched the old detector from the storage shelf, where broken things went to wait for disposal, and compared its weight. The broken one felt light as expected, and the one from room 12 felt like two of them taped together. He unscrewed the broken one and found no strange slot, only dust, a dead battery, and the usual brittle plastic. Renner watched from the doorway and nodded, then answered her phone, and her yes sounded like cautious confirmation. The non-emergency dispatcher had pulled 2 archived calls from the spring that sounded similar, not identical, but close. Each referenced a detector, each asked whether it had been moved, and both targeted rooms paid in cash and late. Renner asked Dorian to print any copies of photo identification kept on file, and he showed the log policy instead. The inn did not photocopy identification unless the card used for payment had a name mismatch or a mismatch with booking. He looked at the lobby camera track for the check-in, and the frame showed a jacket with sleeve stripes again. The face never lifted to the lens, and the cap brim hid most features, but the build matched the hallway pass. The storm eased into a steady pour, the kind that makes a street look polished, and the motel sign clicked. Renner gave Dorian a statement form and asked him to write what he did and why, as precisely as possible. He wrote that a voicemail raised a secret question about a smoke detector, which is not a thing guests ask. He wrote that the detector was wrong for the room, that its weight felt off, and that a slot existed. He wrote that a horn in the background suggested a location near the river tracks and that a freight watermark helped. He wrote that a woman with a cap carried a tote down the hall, and that tapping came through the vent. Renner finished securing the room and returned the hallway to regular use, with a note to keep room 12 closed. She told Dorian that similar devices had surfaced in short-term rentals nearby, and that his details tightened the pattern. She thanked Irena and Quinn for their help, then left with Holloway and the sealed card and the odd detector. Dorian stood in the quiet office and watched the parking lot glow under a light that had survived 4 storms this month. He made copies of everything for the file, then sat with the register and finished what he started hours earlier. The ice machine hummed to life with a stubborn cough, which felt like a small mercy after the nervous work. 2 days later, Renner called to say the voicemail mattered more than he realized because of the horn and the freight. The freight record placed a contractor truck at the warehouse near the river during the call window before dawn. She said the case would likely spread across jurisdictions and that his notes already sat in a shared folder. She did not share more, and he did not ask, because he understood the slow way these things must move to hold. Quinn checked out with a handshake and a tight thanks, and Irina started a new hallway routine that included ceiling checks. The motel added a policy line about devices, not because it fixed the world, but because it set a tone. On the next Tuesday, the phone light blinked again in a different room, and Dorian felt a breath catch. He pressed the button and heard a normal message from a family asking for extra towels, and he laughed because relief deserves sound. He still thought about the spiral notebook, about the starred word ceiling, and about the staged television glow. He thought about the simple question that did not belong, and how such questions sometimes opened doors no one planned. Travelers came and went, the storm season thinned, and the parking lot felt like a stage that forgot its lines. Dorian kept the office tidy and the camera lenses clean, and he learned to trust the hairs rising on his arm. The stranger, found in Larch Hollow. Neighbors along the Ridge Road reported a lone man standing in Larch Hollow before dawn, motionless and facing uphill. Mara Keene, 42, forestry technician, entered the ravine after first light to review storm wash and assess slope instability after weekend rain. She carried a handheld GPS and a laminated soils map, and she kept a basic trauma kit near her waist. The county had seen minor slides last winter, and supervisors wanted fresh notes before crews reopened seasonal trails. Her purpose was routine and documented, and she said the air felt colder than the forecast given by local radio. Her field book later recorded a penciled line reading, reportedly still there, written before she claimed she ever saw anyone. Larch Hollow cuts across the eastern shoulder of Coos County, Oregon, where the timber plots crowd a narrow creek that bends twice. Old survey stakes lean at odd angles, and blackberry thickets press against a discontinuous game trail that drops toward the water. In autumn, the alder leaves slick the soil and run off threads between roots, carrying silt that clouds the creek for hours. Mara knew the turns by sight and sound, and she logged wind direction and a faint diesel odor that never matched nearby traffic. Dispatch logs from the same morning noted no road graders, and state records listed no permitted logging within 3 miles. She reported hearing a human voice near the first dogleg, measured at 40 paces from a flagged snag she had marked last month. The voice was low and even, as if reading from a page that had been folded and kept dry inside a coat. She followed the sound to a pocket of firs that cut the breeze, and she saw a man standing without any gear or pack. He looked around, 50, medium build, clean hands, a button shirt with stitched initials. No one later matched to any business in the county. Some locals claimed such shirts got sold in a church thrift near the bay, but investigators never confirmed the inventory. Mara addressed him as if he were a hiker who had lost the trail, and she kept her tone slow, with her palms open. He did not answer at first, then he said he had come to return a thing he had borrowed, and he glanced downslope. She asked whether he needed help, or water, or a radio call, and he said none of those would help at that hour. Her watch showed 8:17, and she wrote that detail twice, a habit she kept when she worried her timing might be challenged later. Records conflict on whether she then stepped closer or whether the man closed the distance by 2 careful paces. Deputy Saul Redding, 51, County Sheriff's Office, received a welfare call around 8:30, routed through the non-emergency line from a neighbor. Dispatch logs placed him in town refueling, and the drive time to the ridge was 20 minutes if the road stayed dry. He knew the hollow for trespass complaints across 2019 and 2020, usually hunters edging property lines during early fall. He headed out alone, and he radioed a routine field check with no known hazard beyond slick leaves and a soft shoulder. His purpose was to contact any person in distress and to verify no unauthorized vehicles had been left at the upper gate. Mara recorded the man's name as either Laird or Lyle, written with a slant that later complicated forensic enhancement by the lab. She asked for a last name, and he again said he came to return a borrowed thing, then he looked at the creek. His pupils seemed pinned in bright light, though the canopy muted the sun, and his left hand kept 3 fingers pressed to his shirt seam. Reportedly, he asked whether the county still kept the old locker at the maintenance yard, which had once held culvert keys and padlocks. County file from 2009 mentions such a locker by the old bridge yard, though the keys had been replaced several years later. She tried to call it in, but the handheld radio caught only broken carriers, and her phone read emergency calls only with no bars. She moved 3 steps to gain elevation, and the man told her not to climb because the sound would travel in a way the hollow dislikes. She wrote that phrase exactly, and later she told the deputy that the sentence felt memorized, as if learned from another person. Some locals claimed a caretaker used to speak like that when crews closed the creek for culvert work after a flood. Investigators never confirmed the existence of such a caretaker in employment rosters, and state records show seasonal hires with different names. Deputy Redding reached the upper gate at 8:53 and found no vehicle except the county rig and a bicycle with a bent spoke. A laminated trail notice flapped at one staple, and the chain across the spur showed fresh rub where a bumper had kissed it and backed away. He walked the first quarter-mile with his boots scraping wet gravel that held the shape of small hooves and one deep heel print. He radioed his approach and asked any unit nearby to note his time, and the board tagged him green for routine. He did not know about Mara's radio issue until later, and he stated that the hollow always muted signals after rain. Down by the dogleg, Mara stood with the man while the creek stuttered against a culvert that sat half-silted by last week's flow. She asked again what he meant to return, and he said memory travels in objects, and he should not have taken that kind of thing. She did not see any object in his hands, and he avoided looking at her notebook, as if the page itself could unsettle the plan. She asked whether anyone waited for him, and he said someone always waits near water when the season turns toward frost. Records conflict on her next question, but her notes show a line break and a single word reading dresser. The deputy's voice reached them thin and delayed, and the man smiled without showing teeth. Then he lifted his chin toward the upper trail. Mara called back and gave their location with the 2 bends and the flagged snag, and she added the creek noise was rising fast. The man stepped toward the water, and she warned him about the slick bank. Then he told her to listen because a bell would carry. Reportedly, a single metallic strike came from upstream, like a suspended rod hit with a wrench beside running water. The deputy heard nothing from his position, and dispatch logs do not list any equipment operating within that narrow window. Redding found them near the fur pocket, where the creek sounded louder than its width suggested, as if residents lived under the bank. He asked for identification, and the man shook his head. Then he asked whether the locker still existed with its red latch. The deputy answered that county yards kept new lockers now, and old stock had been auctioned or scrapped after an audit 15 years earlier. The man seemed disappointed, and he asked for the year, and Redding answered plain. And Mara wrote that the man looked relieved. Some locals claimed they saw an elderly volunteer in that hollow years ago who checked culverts with a brass key around his neck. The deputy suggested they walk to the trailhead to sort things out, and he offered water and a seat in the rig. The man said he needed to return the borrowed thing first, then he stepped down toward the culvert where water curled and threw pale foam. Redding warned him to stop, and Mara reached for his sleeve, but he raised his hand and said the creek kept the edge steady. He put his fingers into the water and withdrew them clean, then he set his palm flat against the culvert lip as if matching a shape. Investigators later measured a palm-sized shiny patch there, but lab reports described it as scraped algae with no unusual residue. They walked out together, the deputy leading, Mara behind, the man between them with even steps and steady breath that never turned visible. The ridge showed fog rolling from the marsh, and a low engine throb drifted from the highway before fading without any Doppler shift. Redding said the gate would be closed for a while, and he would give the man a ride to town if no one met them at the top. The man asked whether the school still rang a bell to mark fire drills in early autumn, and he smiled when Mara said, "Not anymore." State records mention the bell had been retired 3 superintendents ago, boxed and cataloged. Location currently unknown according to a brief At the rig, the deputy opened the passenger door and asked the man to sit, and he complied without hesitation or visible strain. Mara stood at the hood and wrote timestamps while Redding radioed his status and requested a quick check on missing persons. Dispatch searched the usual lists from neighboring counties and found nothing that matched the rough description or the first name variants. The deputy turned back to the cab, and Mara pointed at the seat where the man had sat a moment earlier. Reportedly, the seat was empty, and the door remained closed, and the gravel showed no fresh print moving away from the vehicle. Redding circled the rig twice and checked under the chassis where mud clung to cooling metal, and he lifted the chain at the gate. He called the hollow by name and asked the man to answer if he had stepped away to the trees for any reason. The creak's sound carried up the spur in distinct pulses, like breath held and released by a patient machine somewhere underground. Mara wrote every word she could recall from the conversation, and she added a note about the locker with the red latch. County file from 2009 again surfaced during the report review, where a photograph showed a red latch on a dented locker door. They returned to the dogleg with care, watching their footing and pausing where leaves gathered as though pulled by weak static. The culvert still sang with water, and the foam showed a trailing loop that repeated at a steady interval against a rock. The deputy touched the lip where the man had placed his palm, and he noted the slick patch felt freshly burnished despite running water. He found no shoe prints distinct enough for casting, and Mara's heel marks had blurred where she had steadied herself near the bank. Records conflict about whether a second metallic strike sounded before they left, since only Mara wrote it and the deputy never heard it. Back in town, they filed a minimal incident report and a longer narrative. Then they tried to trace the stitched initials on the shirt. 2 local laundries reported no marks like that in recent months, and the church thrift logs showed a gap where volunteer notes ended. They checked motels along the highway, and one clerk claimed a quiet man had asked about a room that faced north toward Timber. The dates did not align with the morning in question, and the surveillance camera had been unplugged while a breaker was replaced that week. Investigators never confirmed the sighting, and the name written by Mara yielded no match in any database within the state. Weeks later, a maintenance worker clearing brush near the school found an old bell cradle stored under tarps beside broken desks. The bell itself was missing, and a note taped to the cradle listed a catalog number and an instruction about mounting that no one recognized. A second note mentioned the bridge yard locker inventory and a transfer sheet that had been misplaced during a renovation nearly 14 years earlier. Reportedly, the transfer sheet surfaced in a banker's box at the county archive with a signature that resembled a surname read as Laird or Lyle. State records accepted the sheet as authentic, and the archive logged it without any conclusion that linked it to the hollow. Mara visited the ravine again before winter storms and stood at the culvert while crow calls echoed in the timber to the west. She carried the same laminated soils map, and she placed her palm on the lip where the algae had been scraped to a dull shine. The patch had grown back, and the water ran colder than the air, and a faint diesel odor threaded the turns. She wrote a final line in her field book about a borrowed thing as obligation, then she closed the cover and signed beneath. Her handwriting stayed level and small, and the page included the words reportedly and records conflict and county file from 2009. The deputy kept a copy of the narrative in his desk and underlined each place name, then he drove the ridge one last time in late fall. He listened for any metallic note across the creek, and he measured the echo time by counting aloud between 2 flat stones. The count never settled, and he recorded inconsistent results on 3 separate visits, despite clear weather and steady flow through the culvert. He concluded the hollow folded sound in ways he could not rely upon for distance, which meant witnesses would always disagree on what carried. His memo went into a folder marked Acoustics Observations, and the case remained open only as a routine contact with no offense. By winter, the story had traveled the county, and some locals claimed they knew the man from a mill crew that shut down years earlier. Others said he had worked as a night janitor at the school and guarded old things until they were carted off in a box. The claims never aligned on age or family, and the only consistent detail remained the manner of speaking that felt learned. Investigators never confirmed any of it, and state records could not connect a stitched initial to a payroll or volunteer ledger. Larch Hollow returned to rain and runoff and alder leaves, and the creek carried silt that settled where the culvert lip flared. In spring, a set of archived notes turned up in a teacher's cabinet during a custodial inventory that followed a small roof repair after heavy weather. The notes included a list of items removed from a stage closet, among them a bell clapper wrapped in cloth and tagged for storage. The tag showed a year written in a hand that looked older than the paper, and the clapper weight matched the bell recorded by the district. The clerk dated the note to a time just before the transfer sheet at the bridge yard, and the sequence suggested a routine move between buildings. No one could say how a clapper could sound without its bell, and records conflict on whether anyone heard such a strike that year. Mara and the deputy met once more at the trailhead on a clear morning, and they walked to the dogleg without speaking. The hollow smelled of wet iron and fir pitch, and the creek ran thinner across fresh gravel shaped by a late slide. They stopped at the culvert, and a small heron lifted from the bank and drifted under low branches with slow wing beats. They listened long enough to agree that the place felt ordinary in daylight, with nothing to mark it from any other ravine. They left without ceremony, and the report never changed, and the borrowed thing stayed unnamed in both their files. The town that locked its gates at sunset. Residents of Graybridge in Skagit County, Washington, described a routine that rarely drew attention until the winter of 2019. Every evening, near civil twilight, the municipal swing gates at the north and south arterials were rolled shut and locked. The practice dated back to a flood mitigation plan that repurposed surplus highway barricades as neighborhood barriers. People accepted the ritual as ordinary, and few questioned who kept the keys or why the schedule never shifted. When an unexpected series of incidents clustered around closing time, the pattern became the story itself. The first documented night belonged to Everett Lang, 58, Public Works Maintenance Supervisor, on call to verify generator levels. He drove the service pickup along the riverfront approach while watching barometer readings fall and the wind stir powdered snow. According to dispatch logs, he radioed that the western gate lamp flickered despite a recent bulb change. He parked beside the frame at 4:21 p.m., marked the hinge plate with chalk, and indicated he would return a socket set. State records show his time card ended at 4:29 p.m., though the truck remained on site until after dark. In interviews recorded later, several drivers said the gate looked closed before sunset, which was unusual given the posted schedule. A school bus turned early, leaving 2 students to walk the long frontage path in rising wind. The bus contractor filed an incident note, and the county file from 2009 was cited to explain alternate routes. That file referenced water on roadway conditions during king tides, not early closures or padlock changes. Investigators never confirmed why the chain was moved one slot tighter on that particular evening. 2 nights afterward brought a second account from Mara Jensen, 33, substitute teacher, visiting a friend in town after a late shift. She reported the southern gate partially open at 4:47 p.m., with the reflective panel rocking slightly and then stilling as if held. Some locals claimed she misread wind gusts against the sign face, though the crosswind was recorded as modest. Jensen stated she called the non-emergency line and left a message describing a figure near the hinge post. Archived notes indicate no callback and no official sighting recorded that week. Graybridge had reasons to prefer early closures, including opportunistic dumping on the river pullouts during shoulder seasons. Yet council minutes show the adopted ordinance framed the gates as temporary storm furniture, not nightly perimeter control. The language specified seasonal deployment during marine layer advisories and elevated creek stages. In practice, the town applied the hardware every evening from October through March, then loosened schedules without a written addendum. Records conflict on who authorized the habit, and signatures on renewal notices rotate among 3 clerks. On the last Friday of November, the wind eased and the river flattened under an inversion haze that kept sounds oddly near. Everett returned with a junior technician to adjust the sticking hinge on the western frame. They noted ripples on pooled water inside the shoulder that looked like traffic vibrations without any visible vehicles. The technician logged a vibration test with a wrench against the post and marked slightly dull resonance. Minutes later, the gate swung with a slow finish despite grease on the bearing surfaces, and the lock clasp settled without a rattle. That same hour, Deputy Colin Ward, 47 County Sheriff's Office, ran a patrol loop that included the northern approach. He observed families cutting across the gravel to reach the diner before the gate closed, moving with the practiced timing of regulars. Ward kept a neutral pace, logged plate numbers, and waved two teenagers through the opening with a small vertical hand motion. He later wrote that the gap appeared exactly the width of a compact car mirror span, which struck him as intentionally measured. Reportedly, he considered waiting by the hinge but diverted to a noise complaint near the mill. December brought earlier darkness, and the gates began meeting the sun halfway on clear days that should have stretched the schedule. A hardware store owner said the padlocks sometimes felt warm even in freezing air, then cooled quickly when exposed. A fisheries volunteer said the river sounded less present near the metalwork, like a muffled channel on a radio. Another resident described 3 short knocks from the empty lane that made a dog pull hard toward the ditch. Investigators never confirmed a single physical cause, and weather data offered only modest anomalies. Attention sharpened after a delivery driver photographed the southern gate with the chain fastened through a hole that did not exist earlier. The image shows a neat circle in the panel skirt, clean-edged, free of burrs, positioned where the angle iron meets the crossbrace. Public Works said no one issued a work order and the spare panel in storage had no matching hole. Some locals claimed the photo captured glare rather than new metalwork, though the exposure time was short and the light soft. Archived notes include a printout marked question feature with no follow-up entry. During the first week of January, a light snow covered the approach lanes and kept tracks readable until the plow made its pass. A single set of boot prints approached the western gate from inside town, stopped at the hinge side, then angled away toward the river footpath. The returning path never crossed back toward the lane, and the tracks faded where wind scoured the edge berm. Dispatch logs record Everett calling the footprint pattern in, requesting guidance before opening the frame for the morning commute. Ward logged arrival 8 minutes later and photographed the sequence from 4 angles with flash reflection on the chain. Ward's report states the hinge bolt showed a bright ring where recent friction removed road film. He measured the chain slack and counted links, arriving at a number that did not match the training sheet. The difference equaled 1 link, which could be explained by minor tension variations under cold conditions. He wrote that the padlock keyway pointed down when he left, a habit he maintained for rain management and quick checks. State records include the photo, and the keyway appears horizontal under direct flash. A week later, Jensen returned to town for a weekend district workshop and stayed at a friend's rental near the river. She walked to the store before sunset and paused by the southern gate after hearing a short metallic tap. She saw no vehicles and no pedestrians except a runner on the far path whose headlamp bounced steadily. Jensen described the tap repeating twice, followed by a faint hiss like air leaving a tire at a steady rate. She declined to give an interpretation and asked that her name be recorded without additional context. By midwinter, the gates closed at a time that residents could predict without consulting the posted sheet. Tourists missed the window and parked along the highway shoulder, then walked in under a sky that turned quickly from silver to blue. A volunteer ushered them along with a flashlight and instructed them to step clear of the hinge arc. Public Works kept a second set of keys inside a red box at the fire station and signed them out for emergencies. Reportedly, 2 keys went missing for a weekend, then returned without a log entry. Everett's final detailed entry came during freezing rain, when locks often seized despite preventative lubrication. He noted a ticking sound from the shackle area that reminded him of thermal snap in roof tin. He warmed the lock body with a portable heater and watched the built-up moisture steam away in a thin ribbon. The ticking continued for 30 seconds and then stopped without the usual follow-on rattle. He closed the gate and left the heater running while he checked the opposite frame under a flat gray sky. The following afternoon, a contractor found a child's mitten lodged between the latch plate and the panel rib at the northern gate. No missing child report existed, and the school confirmed perfect attendance for the relevant classes. Some locals claimed the mitten blew from a passing stroller and bounced into the gap during a brief gust. The knit fabric was dry despite earlier drizzle, which the contractor wrote felt inconsistent with the time on his delivery receipt. Archive notes show the item was placed in a lost property bag and never claimed. Ward conducted a simple experiment with a digital recorder, a tape measure, and a bag of sand to dampen vibrations. He placed the recorder near the hinge and opened the gate to the width used during the dinner rush. He listened to playback and heard 3 faint taps spaced evenly, each followed by a very low tone near the noise floor. He repeated the test on the southern gate and captured 2 taps and no tone. Dispatch logs note that he filed the recordings under equipment anomalies without linking them to any active case. A regional inspector visited after a minor collision, bent a reflector bracket, and sent a cyclist to urgent care. The inspector stated the frames met standard, the locks were common issue, and the postings looked adequate for winter conditions. He recommended painting the chain with high contrast bands so drivers could judge closure state at a glance. The town followed the advice and logged the paint purchase under safety materials, second quarter. Records conflict on whether the painter applied a primer coat that might have altered chain stiffness under cold temperatures. In late February, snowmelt filled the culverts, and residents described a hollow roar under the approaches at odd intervals. The gates continued closing near sunset, neither early nor late, as if synced to a clock hidden somewhere in the routine. A visiting journalist asked who owned that clock and received 3 different answers, including a vague reference to legacy timers. Public Works denied any timer beyond the wall calendar pinned above the parts shelf. Some locals claimed an older control box once existed, but no one produced a serial plate or a retired schematic. On the last documented evening before the spring schedule eased, Jensen walked with Everett along the river path after a school event. They discussed ordinary matters and kept their hands in their jackets while the temperature settled close to freezing. At the western gate, they heard a small clink like a coin touching metal without falling. Everett lifted the chain 1 link and set it down, and the sound did not repeat. He checked the latch face and saw a faint crescent in the dust, then wiped it clean with a sleeve. When daylight extended past commuting hours, the gates were rolled open and nested against their posts, and the town breathed differently. No ordinance changed, and no notice was printed, and the habit slipped away as quietly as it began. A few residents kept notes about the winter schedule, including times, weather, and small irregularities that never shaped into conclusions. State records contain everything necessary to describe the mechanics and almost nothing that fixes intent. The files remain available, and the keys hang on a peg behind a steel door with chipped paint.